Prologue, Valley of Death. The Morris district was known as a lonely place to be, but Marco couldn't find it within himself to leave. Maybe it was some form of self-sabotage or Stockholm syndrome for the district that raised him, but even if he had the funds to leave, he often found himself wondering if he would truly pack up his bags and never look back. On one hand, it would have felt nice to get a fresh start, to let himself just be another 18-year-old enjoying life without feeling like he had to look over his shoulder every time he stepped outside of his apartment. On another, he couldn't help but feel like it would be a betrayal to his home roots, to walk away from the district that gave him his battle scars as it held him in its teeth. He fought too hard to call it home, and moving anywhere else wouldn't be the same no matter how much the danger decreased. And besides, where else would he get his favorite snacks that were conveniently only carried at one particular gas station in the moors? He waited with the rest of his groceries stacked in his hands, waiting a few paces away from the businessman in a suit who checked out in front of him. The collar was pressed with a single wrinkle in the fabric, and a sterling silver watch flashed dangerously under the fluorescent lights that hummed loudly with electricity. It was very clear that the man wasn't from the district, probably only stopping by out of an obligation that he couldn't avoid. Marco could see the slight scowl on his face as he handed his items over to the cashier, as if it was disgusting that a man from such a poor district was touching his things. He glanced at his too expensive watch and sighed, rolling his eyes. Marco's attention was snapped away from the interaction at the crackling radio that was perched on the corner of the checkout counter. The news reporter's tone was far too chipper for the early afternoon, but he chose to listen to the woman's excited voice. Late last night, Federation's very own Serpentine went toe-to-toe with Malware, a villain that has been plaguing the Fiotis district for months on and off. The cashier let out a scoff under his breath at the reporter's words, harshly bagging the businessman's things with frustration. The idea of heroes, or the Valiant Federation as a whole, was a hot topic in the moors. A few years ago, there might have been a chance to catch a resident of the district who thought that the superheroes were still doing a good thing by the public. But nowadays, it was hard to find anyone who thought kindly of their organization. The original promise when the Federation was reformed in the early 2000s was that those who were trained to use their abilities would protect each and every district in the city. For a time, they kept true to that promise, patrolling even as far as the moors to scout for any criminals and thieves who were causing trouble. As time went on and the leadership changed hands, less and less heroes were spotted in the poorer districts. In turn, the Moors put their faith and trust into another group of superpowered individuals. "I don't understand the hype around them," the cashier ranted aloud. "There was nothing that our vigilantes couldn't do that the heroes do better." "Right, you mean the strangers who ran around in masks and hoodies with no real jurisdiction, just beating up people whenever they felt like it," the man retorted, shaking his head as he harshly grabbed for the bag of his items. "They are making a difference here. Not like you'd know based on how often you come around these districts," the cashier shot back, looking the man up and down as almost if in challenge. Marco mentally applauded him for not backing down, knowing just how rare it was for people to defend the reputation of vigilantes out loud. "Is that why they were outlawed? Because they were making a difference?" "The only difference they made was creating a dangerous environment in our city," the man egged on. The cashier just frowned, looking almost saddened by his words. Something in the way that the man spoke ignited something in Marco's chest, whether his own anger or something else, and it urged him to take a single step forward. "Was the Eagle considered dangerous when she was working with the Federation?" he asked, feigning innocence in the question. He watched as the man turned on his heels to face him, cheeks red and brows furrowed as he registered Marco joining the conversation. "She's planning on destroying the heroes from the inside out," he hissed, pointing a sharp finger in Marco's direction. "She would have gotten all of us killed if they hadn't done something about her." Neither Marco nor the cashier got the chance to respond as the man stormed out of the store, trying to slam the door behind him as he made his way to a much too fancy car for the area he was shopping in. There was a deafening silence that followed his absence, and Marco could feel the dissatisfaction taking root in his chest with all of the unspoken retorts that died on the tip of his tongue. "Some people," the cashier mumbled under his breath, shaking his head as he began to bag up Marco's groceries. Neither of them spoke, and he did his best to tune out the radio that was still chattering on the counter as he paid for his items and left the store for a long walk to his apartment. He was thankful that the late summer heat had sustained for the time being, finding comfort in the thin jacket that he wore almost everywhere as he began to navigate his usual path. He knew in the back of his mind that he probably shouldn't take so many shortcuts through the alleyways that he found, but he knew how to throw a halfway decent punch if needed, so he didn't feel particularly vulnerable as he walked with confidence. On occasion, he'd see two shady figures talking to one another in hushed voices, backpacks hanging in their hands as they stood close to each other. He'd always take note of who was trying to unlock their cars, with what tools, practically becoming an expert in knowing the type of people who were just having a rough day, being made worse by locking their keys inside their car, or those who were looking for a quick hot-wired ride. Back in the day, before they were outlawed, vigilantes would be the first on the scene of any crime in the moors. While they typically thrive in the cover of darkness, embracing the power of anonymity that came in the nighttime, there were the rare occasions where they'd be the first on the scene of those types of daytime offenses. Now that heroes were finally patrolling the moors looking for vigilantes rather than actual criminals, they became scarce, but not completely extinct. Before Eric Roth, the late leader of the Valiant Federation, made the announcement at City Hall declaring that if one wanted to do hero work, they needed a Federation-issued license to do so. The vigilantes ran the moors. They said that the vigilantes were dangerous, having no one to hold them responsible for the damages or injuries they may cause trying to stop a crime. Even Marco could admit that there were a few cases where a vigilante did more than harm than good. He and the rest of his district knew that it was few and far between. A few years back, right around the time of the outlawing, there was a vigilante-turned-villain known as Bonfire, who attacked the Karas clinic with a handmade bomb. No one in their right mind would ever agree that he was in the right, attacking the innocent and the ill, but there was a piece of the story that the heroes conveniently liked to forget. Bonfire was stopped by the Eagle. 4 years ago, it was a mixed bag for when it came to vigilantes and their identities. A good portion of them not really caring if their nighttime persona could be tied to their daytime life. The Eagle would guard her face and name like it was something precious. Naturally, it only made it more significant when it was announced that she was joining her former partner, another vigilante who embraced heroism, to collaborate with the Federation. For the first time, the districts met the woman known as Enos Wake, the woman who had kept them safe for years without gaining an ounce of credit. No one truly knew the details about what happened in what came to be known as her Federation days, but it led with her being branded as a lawbreaker, just like the rest of her fellow vigilantes. Nexus, who was a former vigilante himself who applied to the Federation's Academy for hero work, took over as leader of the organization, and the rest became history. Marco remembered when the two of them would fight for the betterment of their home district together, being people that would proudly say he looked up to. He would also never admit to anyone that he still looked up to Nexus when he went to the Federation to become a true superhero, since he still believed that he'd come back to the moors and actually make a difference. Now that he was older and he understood the truth of how the world around him worked, he knew that Nexus was just another sellout, and that the Eagle was right all along. When she returned to the moors after being branded as a traitor by Nexus himself, her appearances became scarce. While all vigilantes were considered wanted people, everyone knew that the vendetta was personal for Nexus, and that he'd do anything to hunt down his former partner. The Eagle was smart enough to know, and she refined herself into the shadows, helping their war from afar. Marco knew that she wasn't dangerous or some criminal, and it only fueled the doubt in his mind about the superheroes that were rarely seen in his home district before they were allowed to target the group of people that they saw as a threat to their power. He knew that he looked up to the Eagle for a number of reasons. He knew she'd been fighting for the moors for 11 years, and that she'd never hesitate when it came to going toe-to-toe with the heroes. But he also knew that those weren't the only reasons. Before the Federation became about superheroes, about being public figures to love, it used to be a school and a support group for those who didn't understand their powers when they first developed in the population. Back when the Federation was respectable, they created power tracks for their students, ones that transferred into their training courses. The Eagle fell into what was dubbed as the perception track, modeled after those who were born with heightened senses. Typically, the perception track was overlooked, but Marco always thought it could be a secret weapon if wielded properly. It totally wasn't because he fell into the same category. Even before he unlocked the door to his apartment, he knew that his roommate wasn't home. Polly Everbright, his best friend for as long as he could remember, was probably off doing who knows what to keep herself busy for the day. She was sunshine personified in Marco's opinion, but he'd never have it any other way. He couldn't really recount how they'd met, Polly being from the neighboring district of Desher, But he knew that the moment their eyes had met, there was some sort of electricity that meant they were bonded forever. He'd never met someone who was the pure opposite of himself, but brought out the best in him. It was only logical in his mind that they'd become roommates when they both turned 18, splitting the cost of a tiny apartment in the Moores district like they'd always mused about when they were younger. He swiftly put away the few groceries that he had grabbed and made his way back to his room. The silence of their home rang in his ears as he stopped in the doorway of her empty room. He kicked himself mentally for even missing Polly, knowing that she'd be home before it got too late. He always blamed it on his upbringing, on missing people he never got the chance to meet, but there was a deep-bone instinct to keep those who he loved within his eyesight when he could. Somewhere in his life, he was sure someone tried to tell him that it was an unhealthy way of thinking, but when someone lived in a place that came with the nickname of Valley of Death, the term healthy became irrelevant. He couldn't help but snag his attention on one of the posters on her wall, one that she had kept tucked away with ripping edges. Everyone in the city knew who it was, even if the poster came from the early 2000s, and it caused mixed feelings in Marco every time he saw it. Her name was Aria Braviart, and the world had once called her Valkyrie. When Marco called Polly everything he wasn't, he truly meant that the girl was his opposite. Despite growing up in the Desher district, one that fared only slightly better than the Moores itself, there was still some hope that she carried when it came to heroes. The two of them had never really talked about it out loud, knowing Marco's complete untrust in all of them, but Polly always seemed to be so sure of herself when she talked about them. She wasn't blind to the mistakes they made, and she knew that focusing on arresting vigilantes when there were true criminals around was something to critique, but despite it, she found herself rooting for some of them. Maybe it stemmed from wanting to be a hero herself, or the fact that she somehow managed to find good in everyone she met. Valkyrie was one of the first heroes, along with the founders of the Valiant Federation and Academy. She was a material track hero, manipulating dust particles in her battles up until her retirement. Even Marco could admit the tragedy that was her life-changing injury, leaving her blind and unable to continue her career. She was long out of the public eye by the time Marco started paying attention to the Federation's misdoings, but even he knew she was one of the better ones to come out of their program. Maybe it also stemmed from his late-night conversations with Polly when they were both too tired to move from the couch after long movies and even longer days. There was a sort of desperation when Polly talked about Valkyrie, like she was always trying to hold onto the hope that good people still existed in their dark world. Marco could recount in perfect detail the night that Polly quietly confessed to him that Valkyrie was the reason why she'd sent her application to the Academy. Marco would never blame her for it, because at the end of the day, he knew it's just who Polly Everbright was. In no world would she ever give into corruption for fame. Marco could only hope that when Polly does become a hero, because despite her underwhelming abilities, he just knows the Federation will accept her, that she'll be able to forgive him. With a heavy sigh, he pushed his weight off of the doorframe and all but collapsed into his own bed, electing to take a nap in his room before he began his nightly patrol in the moors. Perched alone on the roof of an apartment building in the Valley of Death, Fisticuff watched the sun dip below the horizon line. It was the beginning of his long routine of the night, and one of the people in the Moores districts were familiar with. While other districts, like the ones with money and important resources, got the attention of superheroes at the Valiant Federation, the Moores had never been that lucky. While top heroes like Nightshade, Serpentine, and Nexus turned a blind eye to the crime that was happening in the lowest income of districts, a new group had taken the responsibility with their negligence, and they called themselves vigilantes. When the Federation branded themselves as the enemy of the public, outlawing them, it was only then did the heroes begin patrolling the moors, and the beloved vigilantes began to disappear. A year after this law was established by the Federation and the mayor was when Fisticuff entered the scene. The return of the Eagle to their district boosted morale as the heroes shunned her, having a lasting impact on a 15-year-old Marco DeLuca. Although the Eagle had returned to the streets, she hadn't been as active as she had been before her collaboration with the Federation. It was then Marco decided that the Moors couldn't continue to rot at the hands of the heroes. With a mask to cover the lower half of his face, Fisticuff was born out of spite and anger. Marco was born and raised in the Moors, so it was no challenge learning the empty streets that many found to be the perfect stomping grounds for theft and vandalism. On nights when he was in a good enough health, he clung to the shadows, watching for those who dared to give the heroes a reason to label his home as the Valley of Death. The warm summer night was nothing like one would expect it to be. The community wasn't suffocating, and the streets were quiet. Despite the usual bustling in the city, with focus, Marco found the near silent song of sparrows in the distance. As he walked through the alleys and the side streets, he kept his attention on alert for any heroes on patrol. The irony wasn't lost on the 18-year-old that he was more concerned about running into the people supposedly making their city safer, despite there being actual criminals that tormented the district. As he turned the corner of an alley, the telltale sound of glass breaking caught his attention. Hushed whispers and a group shuffling around one another was enough to alert Marco of the robbery before he even laid eyes on the 4 criminals. Adjusting his mask and tugging his hood over his head, Fisticuff stepped out from under the streetlight and watched the thieves ignore his presence. When one of the goons eventually saw Marco, he stopped in his tracks, stolen TV in hand. He let out a few swears, dropping off his stolen goods at the trunk of their van, turning to the other 3 thieves. Marco let them silently communicate with each other before one of them ran at him, throwing a lousy punch in his direction. It wasn't aiming to knock him down, but more so to keep him busy so that the other criminals could make their getaway. Sidestepping the hit with ease, seeing it coming from a mile away, he used the momentum of his body to land a solid kick to the criminal's back. Confirming him to be sprawled out on the concrete for a moment, he turned his attention to the other 3. 2 were still locking up their giant truck's trunk, while the last one was anxiously sitting in the driver's seat. From where Marcus stood, he could see his eyes locked onto the vigilante in the side mirror. Fisticuff advanced towards the large of the 2 thieves, still locking up their stolen goods. The man's hands twitched imperceptibly before trying to reach out and grab his arm. Instead, Marco wrapped his hand around his wrist, pulling harshly to knock the man off balance. Not expecting the approach, the man stumbled one step closer towards Marco, who used the proximity to land a punch on the masked jaw. The man shouted in shock, hand instinctively going to rub at the injury. Again, landing a kick on the criminal, he landed a second to the side of his head as he collapsed to the ground near the truck. Before Marco could turn around to fully face the 3rd man, the muted sound of a gun being pulled out stopped him momentarily. Without looking over his shoulder, he focused his attention on the sound of the man's muscles and nerves as he took aim with what Marco assumed was a pistol. He took into account the few milliseconds it took for the man to steady his aim and used that to his advantage. Marco reached into the hoodie pocket and grabbed one of his throwing knives, one of the more useful gifts he had ever received. He threw one at the criminal's left foot, purposely not hitting his mark. It clattered to the street loudly, throwing the man's concentration off. Tracking his eyes behind the ski mask, Marco threw another to hit the limited exposed skin on his arm holding the weapon. The blood swelled from the cut instantly as the man raised the gun and shot blindly. If Marco shut out the rest of the world, he could hear the bullet whiz past him like a fly in the summer. The noise rang around his skull like a reverberation of a church bell. The enhanced sound dangerously clouded his senses for a moment, leaving him vulnerable to the kick he received to the back of his knee from the first criminal that he had knocked out on the street. Falling into a crouched position, he thrusted out his leg, barely clipping his ankle to send him to the street next to his criminal partner. Grabbing another one of his knives, Marco blindly threw it to the still standing man, ignoring the disturbing noise of the blade ripping through the flesh of his bicep. As the man shouted in pain, Marco sprung up from his crouched position to dive for the gun. The unexpected movement gave him the upper hand, allowing him to wrap his gloved hand around the cool metal. Using the adrenaline from the original shot, he wound his fist back and collided the handle of his last throwing knife to the thief's temple. Now no longer around the back of the truck, Marco could see that the final criminal had abandoned being the getaway driver and was now pointing his own gun at Marco. The heroes were right to make vigilantes illegal. You're a culprit just like us, the man huffed out, bitter laughter lacing his words as he stepped forward. If we're at the same status, then I'm doing leagues better than you are at this whole being a criminal thing, he retorted with a snort, throwing his final knife. Using the wide truck, he threw it with enough might to bounce it off of the metal, sighing loudly. He smiled underneath his own mask as the man shouted, reaching for the knife now embedded in his side. Marco collected the rest that he had threw at the others before walking over to the final criminal, crouching down to his level. You're just a dumb kid, the thief hissed out, reaching for his gun that he had dropped in his last resort to win. Marco reached out and grabbed it instead, unloading the magazine with practiced ease. When the police asked who got here before them, please let them know it was Fisticuff. I'm trying to build a reputation here in the moors, he said quietly, but still smug, patting on the man's shoulder like they were an old friend. Being met with nothing more than a few more swears, he reached down and quickly removed the last knife from the man's side. He silently returned to the shadows of the side streets as the police sirens approached. Sitting on the edge of the bakery's roof, Marco felt content with his night as fisticuff. He considered the 4 criminals as warm-ups for the series of crimes that he had also helped stop that night. Even though it was only a few other attempted thefts and a couple of drug deals he managed to scare off, he thought it was a good night. He only had to duck away from patrolling Hero once, and it was someone that the media considered a low-tier fighter. As the sun threatened to break through the horizon line, Marco waited for it to rise as he caught his breath. His abilities gave him exactly 3 seconds to hear the movement behind him before the person cleared his throat to capture Marco's attention. Any of the adrenaline that was leaving his body came back at full force as he stood in front of the last person any vigilante would want to see during their patrol. In his black and green armoring, Nexus stood as still as a statue, full head mask guarding his expression. The few vigilantes that he'd spoken to had told him to avoid Nexus at all cost, that if they ever crossed paths in Marco's nightly patrols, he should turn heel and run. Everyone knew that after his split with the Eagle, he was a soldier. Mind trick abilities were feared no matter how the person aligned, and seeing as Nexus had made his choice, standing with Federation, Marco couldn't help the bolt of fear that shot through him at the sight of the now familiar armor. He knew he couldn't run, couldn't escape the man, because even though Marco might have been faster than Nexus, the Federation leader was like a dog with a bone. Fisticuff wasn't the Eagle, but he knew that Nexus would go to the ends of the earth to arrest him just the same. Maybe that's why he threw the first punch, messy and panicked, as renewed adrenaline shot through his veins. Nexus wasn't like the thieves from earlier, dodging the attempted hit with ease, wrapping a gloved hand around Marco's wrist. With practice ease, he shifted his weight, flipping Marco over his shoulder and letting him fully collapse into the ground. The fall took the air from his lungs, but Marco knew that if he didn't have time to think about the pain and disorientation, he could hear how still Nexus remained, not moving a muscle as he just silently watched Marco struggle to get to his feet. It was a sick realization that Nexus was toying with him. Before Marco could react, throw another punch, or run off the fire escape ladder, all control of his limbs fell out of his grasp. Like tiny needles pressing into the skin of where his joints were, any mental tug he could give against the Mind Track hero's hold sent sharp pains through his body. Helpless, he looked up at Nexus, schooling his expression as best as he could with his heart beating out of his chest. "For a vigilante, your style is quite unique," the man commented, stopping to stand directly in front of the younger boy. He could feel the indescribable sensation of the hero poking around within his mind, scanning and searching for information. Imagining it like slamming and locking a door, Marco forcefully cleared his thoughts about anything other than the hero standing in front of him. Nexus hum in consideration, tilting his head in thought. Marco didn't say anything, afraid that the moment he opened his mouth would be the moment Nexus would worm his way into his mind, learning every secret he was fighting to keep hidden. Even so, he was itching to reach for one of his knives, but the needle-sharp pains that raced through his body at the hero's mental hold prevented him from trying any further. "I've been keeping tabs on you for a while now," he said with an air of casualty. Chills shot down Marco's spine at the idea of holding the top hero's attention, or even crossing his mind at all. Marco still refused to say anything, gritting his teeth together as he tried to fight his way through the control that Nexus still had mentally on his body. He'd been lucky enough to have never crossed paths with the malicious Mind Track person, and he was just realizing what a blessing it was. "You stopped that robbery at the Humboldt Bank a few months back. Saved every hostage in the process," the hero listed, recounting the events that took place almost 5 months ago. Once upon a time, he had held that mission as one of his proudest moments, but now it was tainted in the idea that it was what put him on the radar of the Federation. He could practically feel the satisfaction roll off of Nexus as Marco unintentionally let some of his fear through whatever mental hold he was held under. He couldn't help it, feeling chilled at the idea that the Federation was monitoring him for that long and he didn't notice. They say you live up to your name when it comes to hand-to-hand combat, and your aim with those knives isn't half bad. You're also relatively new to vigilante standards, he continued. You would know, Marco shot back, confidence immediately fading when Nexus took a step closer. Out of instinct, he tried to take a step backwards, but every joint in his body seemed to tense as his control still seemed to evade him. He was sure that his curiosity translated in Nexus's mind as he wondered if the jab at his past landed the way he wanted it to. The Eagle and Nexus were the true heroes of the Moors, but their duoship became forgotten once she had publicly dropped any ties with the Federation, and quickly. It was put simply by most. The Eagle was a vigilante through and through. Nexus buried that past of himself when something shinier came along. Marco guessed that he'd never know if the hero ever missed the vigilante lifestyle as he remained silent. He stared back at his reflection in Nexus's visor, eyes scanning his own mask and ratty hoodie. 18 years old, he realized, was far too young to be considered a villain for only wanting to help people. What I am curious about is what track you are. Stubbornly, Marco chose to stay silent. His track was one of the secrets he guarded close to his chest, never revealing his true abilities. Even when Academy Evaluation Day came around in school, he made it a habit to skip that class period to avoid explaining it to a Federation representative. His track and his powers were his business, not anyone else's. With the limited movement he still had within his body, he shook his head, defiant. It was a sudden, sharp pain that bloomed in his temples that spread through his skull in a throbbing pain. He winced as quietly as he could, not wanting to show weakness, but he could feel the way his body jerked at the instinct to run away. His hands twitched at his side, fighting the invisible hold as he wanted to grasp at his hair to try to alleviate the torment that encased his head. It was in cold realization that he understood that Nexus was trying to read his mind. If he found out what track Marco categorized, it would be a loss to everything he fought for. Despite the perception track being looked over by nearly everyone, it would be losing the one thing that he kept for himself, the one thing he could prevent the Federation from taking from him. They destroyed his district, and they destroyed his role models, but he wouldn't let them make fisticuff another mark on their quota. Strength, he choked out, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. He filled his thoughts with those in the same track. The late Gale Anil as Jupiter, the renowned Nova del Rosario as Serpentine, and every time he threw a punch, a kick, and a hit while on patrol. As soon as it came, the pain in his head stopped. Strength, Nexus repeated, freezing Marco's heart in his chest. I have no reason to lie, he muttered out, as if the opposite wasn't the truth. He had everything to lose if he told the truth. He muted his begging and pleas to the universe to let him keep this small piece of his freedom to himself, to let the hero be convinced. Well, Fisticuff, Nexus began. You know the rules about vigilantism. Resolute, Marco said nothing. He watched as the hero paced a step closer, standing right in front of Marco to the point where he could see the vague outline of the man's face through the visor of his helmet. But rules can be bent, he tacked on, speaking with the same casualty he would use with an old friend. I'm sure you're familiar with the Federation's Academy program? Everyone knew about the Academy, and the way it encouraged the younger generations to apply to become a hero. If they weren't selected their senior year of school on Federation Evaluation Day to get a full scholarship to the Academy, they could still pay to send in their own applications and hope that they'd be allowed into the program. It was almost every kid's dream to attend the school, to be a real-life superhero. Same superheroes who are now arresting vigilantes, no matter how much good they were doing for the poorer districts. So Marco knew it meant nothing good if Nexus was bringing it up to him. Enroll in the Academy, get a hero's license issued by the Federation, and continue your nightly escapades legally, Nexus proposed with a shrug. Or, I arrest you here and now. Caught off guard, he froze, the offer being the last thing he expected. He knew it couldn't be that simple, that there was no way that the notorious vigilante hunter was going to just let him go if he agreed to attend the Academy. Even if Nexus let him go with enough freedom until he came back to the school, he knew that there was no way he'd ever truly trust Marco. He'd be in prison forever, even if it wasn't necessarily behind bars. I don't deal in ultimatums, Marco said, surprising even himself in the way he kept his voice steady. He tried to tug at the invisible hold on his hands, feeling his fingers twitch slightly as he regained some of his free will again. In a sharp movement, any motion Nexus granted him was snapped away, leaving his body as still as a cage to be mentally trapped in. The green hue from the glowing eyes of the hero reflected back at him through the helmet's visor, showcasing the extent of the mind track power. He could feel the unnatural presence in his mind as Nexus pushed and pulled at his thoughts, using his ability as a silent threat. The hero's voice dropped any and all warmth it had before, freezing over as he spoke. Well, now you do. Choose. The apartment was cold and quiet by the time Marco dragged himself through the door. His muscles ached in a way he wasn't used to. The pain didn't stem from the usual hits he was used to taking as fisticuff, but the mental fight he had put up as Nexus kept him still and trapped. Every light inside was still off, and the only noise that his senses could pick up on was the faint clicking of a spoon meeting a ceramic bowl. A quick glance at the time, revealing 6:30 in the morning, answered his assumptions of who it could be as he made his way slowly to the living room of a shared apartment. Perched on the sofa with a bowl of cereal sat Polly Everbright. Her eyes were trained on their old TV, listening to the dull voices of news reporters as they explained the new progressions made by the Federation's heroes. It was rare for her to watch anything hero-related when Marco was home, which he was silently grateful for. Polly had been a saint when it came to his vigilantism, but her love for the heroes never diminished from her childhood. She didn't say anything as he entered, only sparing him a brief glance as he made his way further into the apartment. You could practically feel the double take that she shot him as she looked him over for injuries. While Polly hadn't exactly proved Marco going out and illegally fighting crime, she was never one to leave him alone and suffer if he was hurt. He reached up with a lazy hand to tug down his mask and shot her a forced smile. "What happened?" she immediately asked, placing her bowl on the coffee table in front of her, rounding the couch to stand directly in front of him. Marco tried to step around her, but if there was one thing that he knew about Polly, was that she didn't take avoidance as an answer. "Nothing," he tried. "Just a long night." "Don't lie to me," she scolded sharply, stepping back into his path to block his way. He couldn't help but physically deflate when she reached towards him, one hand resting on his shoulder and the other tilting his head to look him over for injuries. And even though she couldn't see the mental wound that weighed on him the most of all, he was sure that she had found a few bruises and scratches. "I'd never," he told her softly, and he found himself meaning it. She looked skeptical, but eventually nodded as she untensed. Her trust in him made him smile, a real one, as he let himself be led to sit down on the couch. Usually, Polly would have reprimanded him about getting dirt and grime on the furniture, but she seemed content to make an exception for that night only. Once she was sure that he was settled, she made her way to the bathroom, and Marco closed his eyes to focus solely on the way that she shuffled through their cabinet under the sink to find the first aid kit that was used far too often. She returned to the living room and placed the kit on the coffee table, flipping the lid open and reaching for the antiseptic wipes. Marco learned a long time ago that telling Polly he was more than capable of patching himself up after a night of crime fighting, that she'd shoot him a death glare and told him that if he was stupid enough to believe that she'd leave him bleeding and alone, then she'd hurt him worse than any criminal could. Even though she didn't exactly support his hobby, she was still a good enough person to cross the line when to help. He kept his eyes closed as he listened to her movements, feeling her approach his face with the wipes in hand. "This'll sting," she warned quietly, like she did every time. Neither of them said anything as she began to gently wash the scratches on his cheek, the ones that he wasn't even sure how he earned. They'd done this routine before, and Marco prided himself in the way that he barely flinched as the wound was cleaned. He let Polly concentrate for a moment, running over the mental script he began to write in his head when he finally made his long walk home from the rooftop of the bakery. "You know," he started, voice scratchy from lack of use, "I've been thinking about the Federation Academy." The only acknowledgement that he was given that Polly even heard him was the slight hesitance in her movements before she resumed her task. "Okay," she said, drawing out the syllables. In a brief moment, he wanted to take his words back, to abandon the story he began to weave in his head that he thought would give him the best outcome when it came to his only friend. He opened his eyes to look at her, watching as she tossed the antiseptic wipes that were now streaked in blood onto the table to be thrown away, and reached for the TV remote to turn it off. The room was quickly cloaked in darkness. With the light of the rising sun, he could see Polly's small smile. She turned to face him once more, orange hair seeming vibrant as the profile of her face was illuminated by the daylight. Even though she fought to keep her face neutral, devoid of any curiosity that might make Marco think she was forcing him to continue, he could still see the spark in her eyes. Any doubt he had in his mind about what he was going to tell her was diminished when he saw an opportunity to make something better out of the worst night of his life. "I've been thinking about applying," he told her carefully, watching as she stared back at his face. She tilted her head for a moment, brows scrunching as she studied him. "Are you concussed?" He couldn't help but laugh at the bluntness, shaking his head when she reached out and hit his shoulder with false anger. He ignored her huff of frustration as he tried to calm down, feeling the pain radiate in his bruised ribs as he collected himself for the next part of his mental script. "It's safer than running the risk of ending up in jail," he said, even impressing himself with how sound his reasoning was. While it was a factor in his decision, he knew he was better off purposely not telling Polly about the threats he received from the Federation's leader. He had no doubt in his mind that she'd have his back, that she'd defend him from any negative attention he'd received from the press and public. But he also knew that in the back of her mind there would be a small piece that would be whispering, "I told you so." In some ways, she'd be right to think so. But he knew that if he was going to survive the microscope that came with Nexus's attention, he was going to need Polly's full and undivided support, even if it meant giving up the identity he spent so long building up. "Why are you worried about that now?" she questioned, and Marco could hear a hint of something in her voice, but he couldn't discern what it was. "Are you sure something didn't happen tonight?" "Nothing happened," he replied instantly. "I thought it would be a better option considering the hero patrols that are happening more frequently in the moors." Polly remained silent for a moment, lips screwing to the side as she considered his words. He knew that she could see right through him to an extent, but he was prepared to guard her from the truth for as long as possible. Polly had always wanted to be a hero, had always wanted to see the good in people no matter what role or job they filled in the districts, and the last thing he wanted to do was try to rob her from that dream, no matter how Marco felt about the Federation. He knew that when Polly's application would get accepted, because despite her abilities he just knew that she'd get in, she'd be better than the rest of the heroes combined. She let out a long breath, fully relaxing into the couch cushions as she looked over to Marco, shooting him a tired smile of her own. She'd known him long enough to know that there was something that he wasn't telling her, but mercifully, she seemed to withstand her dying curiosity to ask for details. Wordlessly, she offered out her pinky, a gesture that they've done since they were small. "Heroes together?" she offered, with a spark of excitement in her eyes, despite it all. He didn't have the heart to tell her that the application in his pocket was the last thing he ever wanted, that he'd rather burn it into a fine ash than turn it into the Federation for any sort of consideration. So he didn't. Because becoming a real hero was her dream, and in a perfect world, she got to do so with her best friend by her side. Instead, he focused on the freckles that he'd spent so long memorizing, the dimples on the corner of her mouth, and the pure joy that she brought to his life by existing. He reached out his hand and wrapped his pinky around hers, nodding in solidarity, a promise. Heroes together.